Believing that every intervention is potentially warding off a fatal outcome means that what one considers an appropriate response, and in turn a successful result, is wildly different from what would be considered a successful outcome for a condition that was not fatal and may only be temporary.
Ooh, hear that pin drop? Told the doc I was sick of looking at ink blots.
G'day. Just thought I'd do a quick bit of content. I have been talking to someone who is trans and we're in a kind of discussion, which I like because it's good to have pushback on your ideas. Yeah, I don't really want to involve them in the video. I just want to use I just want to get as much mileage out of the work I've put into coming up with responses as possible. So this first bit was in response to an argument basically saying, I'm trans, therefore I know what I'm talking about. So I said, lived experience is just another term for anecdotal evidence. Saying why, because I'm trans and this is my lived experience, is the same quality of argument as saying why, because I'm trans and I said so. Lived experience doesn't necessarily mean that you are in a better position to explain the origins of a particular phenomenon than anyone else. An example of this dynamic can be present during chemical burns. The person experiencing the chemical reaction on their skin feels a horrific burning sensation similar to the thermal burns that they are familiar with. This means that their first instinct is to pour water on it, which, despite their lived experience, misidentifies both the cause and the solution to the problem they are experiencing. The difference is that a person mistaken about their chemical burn is likely to be more than happy to hear the correct method of neutralizing it. On the other hand, when it comes to trans self-perceptions, not only does lived experience not automatically grant one greater level of insight as to its origins, it also creates a strong incentive for an individual to be extremely hesitant to accept evidence that contradicts their initial understanding. This is because a foundational aspect of the lived experience of a gendered self-perception is not simply experience with the symptoms of the condition, but also with having lived for quite some time with a particular understanding of why the symptoms are occurring and what dangers they signify. This is significant because a condition that is thought to be permanent and almost certainly deadly if left untreated will lead to completely different criteria regarding what is and is not a successful intervention. For example, the expected results of chemotherapy would be considered a failure in almost any context that didn't already involve cancer. Believing that every intervention is potentially warding off a fatal outcome means that what one considers an appropriate response, and in turn a successful result, is wildly different from what would be considered a successful outcome for a condition that was not fatal and may only be temporary. Long story short, people behave very differently when they think they're going to die than they do when they don't have this understanding. Impending doom typically makes people a lot easier to control than they otherwise would be, in part because it magnifies the effects of the sunken cost fallacy, where people are less likely to leave something that they have sacrificed for. This is one of the motivating factors behind a doomsday cult. Like with other versions of religious sacrifice, gender affirmation often involves the removal of body parts. Regardless of the ideology, this is an extreme level of commitment to an idea. As such, it would obviously have earth-shattering implications for the thousands of people who have already given dearly to this cause if they were to find out that the apocalypse had actually been cancelled. The next section is in response to the fact that we were talking about a thing I brought up recently, that trans is overwhelmingly a trauma response. And this is basically asking, what about for people who haven't been traumatized who have trans identities? To which I said, as we established earlier, People who haven't been traumatized, who have a gendered self-perception or a trans self-perception, appear to be a tiny minority of the people presenting to gender clinics, as I said before we started direct messaging. So based off the internal documents from the Tavistock, we seem to have a tentative agreement that the vast majority of people presenting to gender clinics as trans have acquired this self-perception from social conditions. The question now is, what about the other people with trans self-perceptions who fall outside this category? What is the motivation behind their identities? So there are multiple considerations. The first that comes to mind is that most people don't readily advertise the most traumatic things that have ever happened to them. So one explanation is that some people who anecdotally appear not to have a history of trauma actually do have one, but that obviously can't account for everyone. So another thing to be conscious of is that people who don't medically transition are likely to have different motivations than those that do. For example, there are many people who call themselves non-binary, which ultimately means eccentric and gender non-conforming. The motivation for their trans identity is likely to be significantly different from the forces that might compel another person to take such extreme action as to sterilize themselves and have their genitals removed. With that understood, there are many explanations for the minority of people who adopt a trans identity in the absence of a specific trauma or traumas. For example, there is a massive disparity between the number of girls and young women transitioning and the numbers of males of all ages and older women transitioning. Girls are in a particularly vulnerable position going through puberty. This also may explain why Gen X women and older tend not to have trans identities. Identifying as being non-binary is particularly popular among young women, not because they necessarily want to be men so much as they want to escape the gaze of adult men as they go through puberty as females in a pornified society. So that's one huge factor that doesn't require an individual to experience any particular trauma. Another motivation for a trans identity is that a lot of people mistake homosexuality for transgenderism, or alternatively try to erase their own homosexuality or that of others using transgenderism. Many homophobic societies are also more accepting of transgenderism than homosexuality. For example, Iran imposes compulsory sex reassignment surgeries on homosexuals and has the death penalty for being gay. They perform the most sex change operations in the world outside of Thailand. Likewise, clinicians at the Tavistock Gender Clinic reported, "We did have a lot of families and parents that would actively tell us, 'Oh, I'm so glad that at least my child is not gay or lesbian,' implying that having a trans outcome would be better for their children." Children obviously pick up on this, so it's no surprise if some homosexual young people opt for being trans rather than gay in order to gain acceptance from family and their peers. In addition to this, there are men, some of whom, such as Andrea Long Chu, are prominent members of the trans community who speak specifically about pornography being instrumental in them coming to a trans self-perception. In this case, their motivation for transition is a sexual fetish. Another group that tends to be older men claim to be the opposite sex because it allows them to prey on people. Men commit the vast majority of sex crimes, and the vast majority of their victims are women. So trans identities are attractive to male predators because they allow them to access women in the most vulnerable settings. Another motivation has also been observed in Scotland, where men were claiming to be the opposite sex for the duration of their prison stay, and then reverting to their original sex once their sentence had been served. So there are additional motivations beyond access to victims. These various factors provide many explanations for why one would adopt a trans identity absent a traumatic experience. But due to an inability to recognize the capacity for self-ID to be used opportunistically, gender theologians Gender theologians have no choice but to say that these experiences are as entitled to unquestioning approval as someone who was actually suffering from an innate and potentially fatal condition. Also, the symptoms of the condition are a separate issue to the conceptual framework that is used to describe it. The universal experience of thirst, a physical sensation, which could in certain cultures be described as, for example, wanting a Pepsi. However, this is a way to address thirst which is only comprehensible in certain societies. Wanting a Pepsi is not an innate condition, even if being thirsty is. This is similar to how the burning sensation of a chemical burn can be interpreted as needing water, but this is a socially developed understanding of the situation, not an innate response. Accepting that an affiliation with the cultural norms of the opposite sex is a medical condition that is potentially fatal could only happen in a society where the differences in these norms imposed on the two sexes was inflexible and extreme. The next response is in regards to a comment essentially saying that trans identities respond to nothing except validation. To which I said, if this were true, then there would be no such thing as a detransitioner. The existence of detransitioners is as confronting to a gender ideologue as homosexuality is to conservative Christians, because in both cases, the very existence of either group undermines their God. The biggest sin in the church of gender ideology is regret, because regret implies a number of troubling concepts that gender ideology firmly rejects. Regret implies a material world that has a past and therefore a future, not just an endless now. And perhaps most offensively, it implies that pursuing even the most desired personal preferences could produce a negative outcome instead of the expected spiritual transcendence, and that this result could occur primarily due to a disconnect between the material world and an individual's desire, in which material reality is primary and ultimately wins out over personal preferences. According to gender ideology, this is not supposed to be able to happen, because the first rule of gender ideology is that the customer is always right. As such, great lengths are taken to remove examples contrary to this understanding from public consciousness, or, whenever their existence does become undeniable, dismiss them as an irrelevant aberration with no broader implications. As a result of this, people with trans self-perceptions have a heavy burden on them to never publicly regret anything related to transition. Regret is blasphemy. It is denying the supremacy of their God, individual desire. Regret is seen as the ultimate betrayal to the group, and as such is virtually a declaration of war, which comes with intense social and sometimes even physical consequences. And as we know, most people with trans self-perceptions came into this movement already traumatized, and as such are particularly vulnerable to this type of group bullying. This is why it's a stereotype in trans TikToks to have someone who, in their pursuit of transition, has been very badly hurt by the medical establishment, who will then explain the crippling condition they are in and the agonizing pain that it has caused them, but nonetheless will always preface these reports by saying something to the effect of, "I don't regret my transition, but..." Somewhat like the old cliche, "I'm not racist, but..." In both cases, the person is basically saying, "I know what this looks like, but it's totally not that." One of the things that trans activists often hold up as proof that trans identities are innate is some low-quality data suggesting that trans regret is as low as 1%. Whereas the regret rate for traditional interventions like shoulder or knee surgery tends to be something like 10%. This reminds me of when Bart changed all the F's on his report card to A's, And Homer responded by saying it would have been easier and more realistic if you had made them into bees. A 1% regret rate is what an advertising guru would want the answer to be. But to anyone who realizes this answer is unheard of in the world of actual surgeries, a world where we already know that the people receiving the surgeries are capable of publicly expressing regret, what a result of 1% actually suggests is not that all the surgeries are working as intended, but that this group is uniquely incapable of publicly expressing even normal levels of regret. After all, no one is being compelled to get knee surgery in order to win back the love of their homophobic parents, and yet this was reported as having been widespread at the Tavistock. So it seems strange that operations decided on by adults for medical reasons are resulting in more regret than operations decided on by children who are using the operations in an attempt to relieve immense social pressures. Just as people don't get knee surgery to win back their parents' love, people who get knee surgery also don't care if other people who get knee surgery regret the process. And as a result of this, people who get knee surgery are more likely to be honest about any regrets that they may have. Added to which, the same medical professionals will continue to care for the patient after a knee surgery, regardless of any regrets. On the other hand, once a person is no longer trans, they are not just seen as an ideological challenge, but also an economic dead end for the movement. The medical establishment is never going to make as much money out of a detransitioner as you will from someone who still believes. In fact, the presence of a detransitioner at a particular service is a liability due to the fact that it could cause friction with the more profitable users. This means that there are multiple layers of pressure bearing down on a person who has already shown a willingness to hurt themselves permanently in order to fit into a group. So occasionally I get responses from people saying things like, I've got someone new who I want to try and peak trans, or I've got someone, or you've helped me peak trans different people in my life, and that's great. Sometimes, like, most of my content isn't really targeted at someone who is a believer, I guess. It's so, in that sense, it's not really worded in a way that would be, welcoming to them necessarily. I don't go out of my way to be hostile, but I don't censor myself when I'm trying to ordinarily. Whereas this video, because I'm talking to someone who is coming from the other side, I'm sort of filtering what I'm saying through that sense. So if you're looking for something that a new person might like, this is probably more along the lines of something they would get something out of. Anyway, like, comment, subscribe. I'll see you all soon.
Like right before tonight's show, I looked in the reflection of my Diet Coke can and I said, hey, kid, I want to see 20%. If not 5. 'Cause so what? Who cares? It doesn't even matter.